If you have a C5 or C6 Corvette with the F55 magnetic selective ride control system and your mag ride shock absorbers need replaced, it can be an expensive and confusing headache. So I'm here to help save you time, money, and Tylenol in this helpful 3-part video. In part 1, I'll cut through all the outdated misinformation out there to reveal the most affordable options that are currently available. In part 2, I'll use this knowledge to swap out my original F55 magnetic shocks in my 2003 C5 with budget-friendly Bilsteins, plus new shock delete simulator tech in the internet's only step-by-step tutorial on this unique process. And finally, in part 3, I'll head to the canyons and give my honest review of my new magnetic-free setup to see if I made the right choices. Part 1. The truth. The first thing that many people get confused about: F45 is not F55, and replacement options for F55 are much more limited. F45 was the option code for the Selective real-time damping 3-way adjustable suspension option that was available in the C5 from its introduction in 1997 until 2002. In 2003, F45 was replaced by the more advanced F55 mag ride option, which now had a 2-way adjustable suspension switch. And it was a popular option, with roughly 21,000 C5s ordered with F55 during the 2003 and 2004 model years. When the C5 evolved into the C6, the F55 package was kept basically intact and found another 35,000 customers during the 6th Gen Corvette's run. Magnetic selective ride control got its name because the shock absorbers are filled with millions of tiny iron balls that the car's computer can magnetize, instantly changing the firmness of the shock absorber based on sensors that look at speed and ride height to keep the car on an even keel, even over extreme bumps. So how do you know if your F55 shocks are bad, and what made me think it was time to replace mine? The easiest way is to flip between the sport and tour settings while driving. You should feel a very noticeable change in how stiff the car rides. If you don't, it means the system is likely stuck on one of the two settings. In my case, the switch still made a big difference, but after a year of ownership at around the 68,000 mile mark, I noticed the ride quality in each mode got progressively worse. On tour, the ride felt floaty and unsettled, and in sport, it felt like the Corvette crashed over bumps. Additionally, an annoying creak developed from the upper front end whenever I drove over bumps. Take a listen. But the telltale sign of old F55 shocks is heavy leakage. And while you're under there, check if there are any of these small yellow straps attached to plastic shock stuffers. There's a small chance these were left on from the factory, as some dealerships forgot to remove these spacers after they were shipped. Obviously, these will give your Corvette a bone-jarring ride if they were accidentally left on. The most obvious solution when it comes to F55 replacement shocks is to install identical new ones, but there's a few problems. For a single front F55 shock, you'll spend between $470 online or up to $1,300 from a Chevy dealership. But if you have a C5 with F55, price might be a moot point anyways, because as of now, rear F55 shocks built specifically for the C5 are all gone. Trust me, I spent weeks calling every single resource that might have them, to no avail. The only full F55 shock kits that you'll actually find in stock are suspiciously cheap knockoffs. But I've heard endless comments about how these off-brands never seem to interface correctly with the Corvette's computer system, so I wouldn't waste your time. Now, if you have a C5, it might be possible to use the rear F55 shocks from a C6 instead. The parts number for the rear F55 shocks are the same for both the C5 and early C6. And Volunteer Vet sells the same rear magnetic shock that covers both generations interchangeably. When I called them, they verified that this should work for the C5 and that they've had one C5 customer order these who didn't return them. So if you've used C6 magnetic rear shocks successfully in a C5, please confirm that this works in the comments below, and I'll make sure to pin any updates. But even if you can find a full set of all new F55 shocks, you'll still have to cough up between $2,400 and $4,000 for parts alone. If you're like me and that's too much of a punch in the wallet, then you'll need to move on to the more common option, swapping out the fancy magnetic shocks for more affordable, conventional, non-electrical shock absorbers. But there's downsides with this strategy as well. That magic carpet magnetic ride will be lost forever and you'll lose the switching ability. Plus, after you swap to conventional shocks, the computer system will throw a service warning that you'll see on every single startup, and your top speed will be limited to 80 miles per hour. A crushingly low top speed for us Corvette drivers, am I right? To avoid freaking out the computer, there are two options. One is to use a special GM Tech 2 compliant scanner system connected to the body control module. There's a series of steps to delete the ride control system from the car's computer, listed here, so that the Corvette thinks it never had that option in the first place. But make sure you know what you're doing. Any system that you delete, accidental or otherwise, means it's gone from your car's system forever. You can buy GM Tech 2 scanners, but genuine examples are frightfully expensive. But there are some off-brand units that seem to work. For example, this YouTube video from the channel Tad's Workshop appears to demonstrate an Autel scanner that worked for his 2004 C5. That scanner goes for a more reasonable $450, and it might be worth it if you're planning on doing deep dive automotive electrical work. Otherwise, it's cheaper to pay specialists to do this service. My Chevy dealer charges $260, and independent shops will charge somewhere around $80 to $160 to program this out. For example, C&S Corvettes in Florida currently charges $136 for this scanner service. And a huge thanks to Lyle and his friendly C&S team for taking the time to chat with me during my investigation. Their 5 decades of experience working on Corvettes was invaluable for my research. They have a great YouTube channel, check them out later. Okay, according to C&S Corvettes, for 2003 model years like mine, the GM scanner method has a 100% success rate. C&S has done this hundreds of times, no problems. However, for 2004 model years, they report only a 50 to 60% success rate. And no one seems to know why the scanner method seems to work well on some 2004 models, but not the others, not even apparently the people at Chevy who designed these things. But all is not lost, because if the scan tool doesn't work, you can use a simulator system instead. Specifically, this one from Shock Delete Engineering, also based in Florida. These simulators plug into the 4 shock wiring harnesses plus the 4 ride height sensors. They tell the computer that the original magnetic shocks are totally fine even after they're long gone. To my knowledge, this is the only plug-in shock delete product currently available for 2003 and 2004 C5s with F55 MagneRide. So I got in touch with this company as well, and they were very responsive and cordial. They told me this product has been around for about 5 years, and they've sold several hundreds of these kits to happy C5 owners and specialist shops. For example, C&S Corvettes told me they've installed these shock deletes in around 40 of their customers' Corvettes without problems. The nice thing about this option is if you're a shade tree mechanic, like yours truly, you can now swap the shocks out and install these simulators by yourself without the need of a specialized scan tool. But at $400 for the full set, it is more expensive than paying for a GM Tech 2 computer service. But personally, if I had a 2004 model, I'd probably just go straight to this option because I'd hate to pay for the computer scanning service when there's a decent chance that it won't work. Even though I have a 2003, this shock delete kit was what I went with. There's not much out there on how exactly these shock deletes plug and play, so I figured I'd give them a shot and show you all how they work. Also, by doing all the work of the shock swap myself, I'd save around $800 to $1,600 of parts markup and labor costs that I'd pay a service shop or dealership to do this job. But first, I had another big decision to make. Which conventional shocks did I want to use on my car? The Bilstein B6 came up again and again as the most often recommended, as this shock seemed to be a mild upgrade offering ride quality that's close to stock. By the way, some sites like Zip Corvette or Corvette Central refer to B6s as Bilstein HDs. Yes, Bilstein, not Bilstein. I'm gonna try to use the correct German pronunciation in this video. Now, if your car is lowered, you'll want the Bilstein B8 variant, also known as the Bilstein Sport. This stiffer design prevents a lowered car from bottoming out. Even if you have a stock ride height, Some folks still prefer the B8 for its sharper handling, even if ride quality suffers. Another popular option for the performance-minded is the OEM shocks from the C6 Z06, which are around the same price as the Bilsteins. Again, reviews say these deliver better cornering at the expense of a more penalizing ride. If you want flexibility, you could go for adjustable shocks like these from QA1, which have knobs with different firmness settings. However, you have to go underneath the car to reach these knobs, and they are a more expensive option. As for me, I use my C5 as a daily driver with occasional bouts of canyon carving. So because I prioritized ride comfort and value, I decided the popular Bilstein B6 package was what I wanted to try. Now, as far as where to buy my Bilsteins, I reached out to Zip Corvette first because I've had many years as a happy paying customer. Zip has been around since 1977 and their customer service is always excellent. But now that my channel has grown, they were kind enough to send me a set of new B6s pro bono. So a massive thanks to Zip Corvette, linked down below in the description with the exact shocks that I used. Another big thank you to Shock Delete Engineering, who sent me their full kit free of charge for me to try. Link below as well. So with my hardware and software ready to go, it was time for installation. Now for a step-by-step guide on how to swap out the original magnetic F55 shocks on the C5 or C6 with new conventional shocks. No single tutorial out there shows every part of this process, so I pieced together my plan of attack from dozens of other guides, coming up with what I think is the easiest and safest way to do this. Now my setup is about as cheap and rudimentary as you can get, hand tools only and working in an alley behind my apartment. So if an intermediate mechanic, like myself, can do this, so can you. And if you're a true beginner, check out my top 5 car repair tips video here before digging in. Step 1. If you're using shock deletes, switch the controller to the tour setting and leave it there. The sport setting could potentially damage the shock simulators by sending excessive current to them in the higher setting. Constantly going back and forth for placebo effect should be avoided from here on out. Next, anytime you're dealing with electrical components, use an 8mm wrench to unhook the negative battery terminal. This avoids potentially short-circuiting the car or yourself. Before lifting the car, grab a 19mm deep socket and an extension to crack the wheel nuts loose. It's best to work on one axle at a time, so I started with the rear as it's a bit easier to deal with. Place some wheel chocks ahead of the front wheels to make sure the car doesn't roll forward when the back is lifted. The simplest and safest way to jack up the rear is to place a piece of wood on a low-profile jack and lift the car from the rear frame crossmember, placing jack stands on each side for stability. With the rear passenger side wheel removed, we can now see the ride height sensor unit. And notice the wire that leads down to the connection that we'll deal with in a bit. Now on all 4 corners, you can remove these height sensing units completely. You can even sell them for around $70 to $100 a piece. But there was this mystery line going straight into the rear caliper that I didn't want to mess with, and I wanted to keep this tutorial as simple as possible. So I left my height sensors on as a few extra pounds of dead weight. As for the shock absorber electrical components, follow the loom down to this connection and carefully unclip it. All these plastic clips are decades old, so go easy on them. Before removing all the bolts, you can make your life easier by using some penetrating fluid. I like Croil the best. It ain't cheap, but it works more miracles than any other penetrant that I've tried. Amazon affiliate link for this and other specialized tools in my description below. There's a big bolt going through the bottom of the shock with a nut on the other side. Both are 24mm, and you'll need a deep socket for the nut, holding one side to stop it from spinning while you loosen the other. The bolt won't slide out easily until you put the lower control arm under load, so you'll want a small second jack for this job. With the lower control arm loaded up, the bottom bolt slides right out. Another useful tool I recommend is this grip mat, which keeps the nuts and bolts in one organized space. There are 2 13mm bolts up here, and the back one can be tricky to get to, so make sure you have some extensions, wobble sockets, or universal joints to get them out. Lift the load off of the lower control arm with your small jack, and then use a pry or crowbar to get the bottom of the shock absorber free. It's easiest to feed the shock wiring loom out through the top when we remove the shock, so release this metal clip holding it to the frame. We'll need this loom later, so be gentle with it. You should now be able to compress the shock by hand and feed it through the bottom. Finally, the old leaky shock is free. On the old shock, remove the sensor that's clipped up top. Then pull out this rubber attachment, which we also won't need. All we're going to reuse is the metal plate and the wiring loom itself. Now gingerly release the side clips that hold the sensor to the wiring loom and pull the loom free. The shock wiring loom can now be put back into its original spot. Clip the blue end back to the pigtail and connect the other end to the new 2-pin shock delete simulator. You can now stick this loom and simulator wherever you see fit, just as long as it's clear of any moving parts or intense heat sources. I decided to stick close to its original upwards orientation, where I could also reuse this metal clip. To secure the shock simulator, I grabbed some zip ties. These 8-inchers are the perfect size, that's what she said. Just make sure whatever zip ties you use are heat resistant. Now onto the height simulator connection. Unplug it and you'll see that it's a 3-pin design. This matches up with the new black shock delete height simulator, which plugs right in. I placed the new simulator right next to the old, now dead, ride height sensor pigtail. Okay, back to the old shock, which needs to be freed from this metal mounting plate. A 17mm ratcheting wrench will make this entire job go much faster. But this is where I hit a snag. The nut on the shock will spin, so the stem has to be held super firm. The shock stems have this funky D shape with only 2 flat sides that are difficult to get a good grip on. I thought that I was prepared for this by getting a special General Motors double D socket ahead of time, but turns out it was too small for these special magnetic shocks. My other 2 backups that I got from Amazon were also too dang small, so don't waste your time with these either. If anyone out there has a link with the correct F55 shock stem socket, please put it in a comment below so I can pin it, because that would have made this job a lot easier. I ended up using a vice grip on the stem and brute forcing the nut loose. Next, remove this metal washer hat and the plate from the shock. There are 2 rubber cushion bushings that sandwich the plate, so twist and remove those as well. Make sure the plate is clean, because we'll be using it with new hardware that Bilstein provides with each shock. Time to make a new shock sandwich in these layers. The nipples of the fresh rubber bushing need to sit inside the plate so that the flat rubber sides are facing the metal washers. Top it off with a new 17mm nut, which we need to tighten on. Mercifully, the stems of the Bilsteins use a regular old 5mm hex key to hold them in place. Get the nut on tight enough where the rubber pads are just starting to squish out. While the shock is out, this is a golden opportunity to condition all the rubber bits that are currently exposed using this hack I learned from the Scotty Kilmer channel. This AT205 resealer is proven to recondition old rubber, so pour it out into an empty spray bottle. And now you have a handy dandy rubber conditioning weapon to keep your bushings and boots nice and fresh for as long as possible. The old shocks were pretty soft without their electric current and were easy to squeeze out of the wheel well. And as you can see, these new ones are several times stiffer. So they'll need to be compressed to fit using bigger zip ties. Actually went overkill here. These zip ties were far too heavy duty and were too big to fit through the holes, so I'd recommend something a bit smaller. But the idea is to use the zip ties to get the shock to stay compressed. The new compressed shock goes in through the bottom, and you can put the bottom bolt back in finger tight. Once I released the zip ties, I realized that the upper control arm was impeding the shock, so I jacked up the lower arm to give it more room. And be certain that the white marker on the shock plate is pointing towards the front of the car. Before reinstalling these 2 upper bolts, I added a dab of blue thread locker. It's totally optional, but I like the extra security. I'm a big believer in following proper torque specs whenever possible. The rear upper bolts are torqued to 22 pound-feet each. Before torquing the big lower bolt tight, make sure the lower control arm is sitting at right height to prevent rubber binding about halfway up its full travel length. The updated torque spec for the lower rear nut is 107 pound-feet, and it's good practice to torque the nut instead of the bolt on the other side. Repeat the entire process on the driver's side rear corner. Slap on the rear tires, get those nuts hand tight, and drop the car back down. Don't stress if the ride height looks ridiculously high at this point. The suspension will settle back down to normal after just a few miles of driving. Now for the front shocks, and we'll start with the driver's side. Because the nose is too low to fit a jack underneath, it's easiest to jack up each front corner separately, using the jacking points on the perimeter frame behind each front wheel. A must-have for any C5 or C6 owner are jack pads, which slot into the perimeter jacking point holes on each corner. I then place a jack stand on the front frame for extra security. To access the top of the driver's side front shock, we need to remove the washer fluid reservoir with a couple of 10mm nuts. With the reservoir out of the way, the top of the front shock electrical connection is revealed. Simply push in the metal ring, lift it off, and set it aside for now. Before we really dig in, employ some sort of fender cover to protect the paint here. I just use an old sweatshirt. Look underneath the lower front control arm and you'll find two 13mm nuts, which are attached to two 13mm bolts that hold the bottom of the shock in place. One of those upper bolts has a brake cable that's kind of in the way, so go ahead and unclip it for more access. You'll need a 13mm deep socket to get to the bottom nut while you hold down the top bolt in order to remove these two nuts, but keep the bolts themselves in place for now. Now onto the top, where the shock stem has that same devilishly slippery D shape to contend with, except this time we'll have even less leverage to hold it while you remove the 17mm nut. Not gonna lie, I was on board the struggle bus with this one at first. My crescent wrench couldn't get a good enough grip on the stem, and neither could my bigger locking crescent wrench. Finally, I realized I could spray Croil right where the stem meets the nut to help loosen it up. And then my smaller vice grips afforded a good enough purchase on the stem to finally get the dang nut free. With the nut relieved of its perch, you can now remove the large metal washer and rubber bushing up top. You'll notice that the shock is now colliding with the upper control arm, so again, use your small jack to raise it up to make enough room. Go ahead and remove the two lower bolts so that the bottom of the shock is free. You should be able to compress the shock with your hands enough so that you can remove it from its top post and then wiggle it out the bottom front. By the way, if for some reason any of those old shocks are too stiff to compress and remove, you can loosen the upper A-arm 15mm bolts to gain some extra space. Just make sure to torque them back into place at 48 foot-pounds each when you're done. But what a great feeling getting these old junky shocks out. I noticed there was a lot more leakage on these front shocks compared to the rears. Don't forget to remove the old bottom rubber cushion from the top mount. For the new height sensor simulator, follow this wire down to the height sensor connection and carefully unplug it. I pried out the now dead height sensor pigtail because I wanted to use the hole it was mounted in for zip tying in the new height simulator, which ended up looking like this. Now to prepare the new front shock. The bottom mounting bracket needs to rest at an angle so it will mount flush. So use a screwdriver to pry it back to about 30 degrees. Use the new provided kit to make half a sandwich, which will be just like the rears, but we'll leave the upper part of the sandwich for later. Compress the new shock with zip ties, feed it up into position, free the zip ties, and replace the bottom bolts so the shock won't slip off. With the small jack putting the suspension under ride height load, the two bottom nuts can now be installed, torquing them down to 21 pound-feet. And don't forget to put this brake line back into its bracket. Back up top, take a moment to ensure that the stem of the shock is nice and centered so that you have a nice even seat. We'll top our shock sandwich with the new rubber bushing pad, making sure the nipple is facing down, followed by the new large metal washer, and finally the new 17mm nut. This is how it should look like when you're finished. Go ahead and remove the original shock attachment from the cable and grab the new Shock Delete simulator. I should have shown this earlier, but take note that all four of these shock simulators have little grooves inside so that you can't install these upside down. Snap this guy in, and now we need to place it. I found it fit well snuggled in here. With the washer reservoir back in place and the Shock Delete zip tied in, this was the end result, nice and cozy. That'll do it for the driver's side, so we'll put the tire back on and reset to the passenger side front. Over here, the coolant reservoir needs to be removed with three 10mm nuts. Two are up top, and there's a third one that's on the side facing the engine that's more like a locking tab. I then used my Croil and vice grips method to remove the nut from the stem, which went smoothly this time. I should have thought of that earlier. Everything on the passenger side front corner was the same as the driver's side, except for slightly different placements of the Shock Delete modules. Up top, I strapped the Shock Delete simulator next to this wiring loom. With the coolant reservoir back in place and everything buttoned up, here's how the Shock Delete looked from underneath. Almost done. Put the tire back on and bring the Corvette back down to earth. Torque all the wheel nuts to 100 pound-feet, going around in a star pattern for an even seat. Don't forget to remove your wheel chocks and the rubber jacking pads from underneath. Reconnect the battery with the 8mm wrench, and you are done with a surprisingly messy but satisfying job. But let's make sure there aren't any warning codes before we celebrate. All right, F55 no more. Part 3, the review. After a week of driving around town to give my new Bilsteins a chance to settle in, I set off to the nearby mountain roads to see if I made the right choices, if I'm going to miss my old magnetic ride, and to see if all that work was worth it. All right, I'm out on my favorite canyon road to see how the new shocks feel. And here's my favorite corner. Let's see how it goes. Woo! Gotta really get in the brakes. Yeah! Woo! Okay, there's a little bit of roll, but not too bad. It's pretty flat. This reminds me very much of a C5 or C6 Z51 setup, which was the sport suspension version. It feels nice and taut and controlled. It is that middle ground between the sport setting and the tour setting. The old sport setting I would only use for when I was out here, but what I didn't like about it was almost like it took the suspension travel and just eliminated it by like half. Out here, you don't want to have it to be rock hard, otherwise the car will sort of skip over bumps instead of just soaking them up nicely, which is what you want. Now around town, yes, it is certainly firmer than the old tour setting. The highway ride is still pretty smooth. Again, not quite as soft as the old tour mode was, but it's fine. Now, when I talked to Lyle at C&S Corvettes, and he's put the B6 Bilsteins on a ton of customer cars, and he said he's only had a couple complaints. And those complaints were essentially from people who really wanted like a old Buick ride. And yeah, this is not that, but it's absolutely acceptable for a sports car. And for like 85% of people, this is gonna be the right setup. If you want something firmer, like you're doing a dedicated race car on smooth track surfaces, the B8 Bilsteins or the C6 Z06 OEM shocks, that's probably gonna be for you. I think it's gonna be too stiff for everybody else. For anyone who wants a softer suspension, and they just use the Corvette to like, you know, go to car shows and get ice cream, then I would go for the normal OEM standard C5 shocks, and that's gonna be more of that plush, pillowy ride that I think you might be after. In fact, know that video that they used to try to sell F55 when it first came out in 2003, and you see that normal Corvette just bouncing all over the place on the whoop-de-woos, and then you see the F55 car and it's just like nice and steady. I would have loved to see a comparison with the Z51 suspension car, not just the normal base C5, because a normal base C5 actually has a somewhat floaty suspension. The Z51, which is what these Bilstein B6s to me feel a lot like, is a lot more controlled. Like here's a big bump right here. Let's see how it bumps and settles. It's like no problem. It just sort of feels pretty even, just like the F55 in that video. So it's not really something I miss. Now, a couple nice bonuses. That creak that I was hearing in the front end is gone, thank God. And I swear I have a little bit more ground clearance in the front, or maybe the front shocks aren't quite as like spongy as they used to be, but hey, I'll take every help I can get to keep my nose from scraping every dang place. This is everything I hoped it would be, and I'm quite happy with it. So those are my thoughts. Now I want to hear from you in the comments below. Extra special thanks to Zip Corvette and Shockley Engineering for providing me the parts to bring you this video. Now, if you excuse me, I got some driving to enjoy.